Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Enrique Merino wash processed Ecuador from Say Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York. And this is our first Say review of 2025, and certainly not our last, as they've already released 5 Mejorado coffees this year, 4 of which are coffees that we've never reviewed from them before, including this one right here. So you'll definitely see so many of those Mejorado reviews from them coming up here in the near future. But this is the first of the bunch that we decided to pick up from them, as anytime Say does release a Mejorado coffee, especially ones that we haven't reviewed before, it immediately catches my interest and attention, and this one was certainly no exception, especially given that I don't have any familiarity with this producer. So I'm definitely looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a significantly higher extraction one at a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This one is a little bit more classic Say, as one of the other Mejorado coffees that we are reviewing didn't feel quite as light as this one did. I'm not necessarily saying that this coffee is overly light, as oftentimes it can get a little difficult to discuss Say's profiles because they have more recently skewed a little bit on the more developed side of things, but some of them do still continue to remain a little bit true with any of those roasty qualities. So for that reason, I can say that this one still skews on that slightly more light side of things. It's not necessarily overly light as what it once used to be, but even then it is still lighter by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was a bit off based off of this first try, as it was pretty uneven and undefined overall. It does offer a slight robustness to go with that undefined citric quality, and that's kind of what I'm alluding to, is that it's not necessarily the lightest coffee out there, but as we progress through this coffee, it did seem to open up from that first experience. There is a bit more sweetness presented on the cool down, as the coffee just felt a little early and in need of some adjustments. Day 17 through the Chemex, and this was significantly a better second impression, as it's sweeter and better defined with a much more even sense to it. Higher level of sweetness as well in the classic Mejorado-like sense, with plenty of the listed honeysuckle and a very faint berry and citric feel, that all of which felt was much improved compared to that first day. Day 20 through the April brewer, and the coffee has taken a bit of a shift, as most of the red berry components have now become the abundant quality within this coffee. And even then, it was skewing what I would say pretty far in the strawberry jam-like direction, with plenty of honeysuckle yet again. But even then, it just became so dominated by that red berry component that it was interesting compared to the first try, where it was almost non-present, to the point now where it's just so pronounced within this coffee. Day 23 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and the coffee in general did feel like it was improving, with some faint berry aspects now being a little bit more prominent in a sweeter sense, a little bit more tropicality in terms of the brightness as well, with plenty of the Mejorado sweetness in the cool down. And that's usually the direction I go when it comes to Mejorado coffees, is that I usually get better results from them when you kind of go a little lower on the extraction. However, I did hear some people saying that this coffee needed to be pushed a little bit more, and that's why we're going to kind of change up our recipe a little bit when it came to this one. As on day 26, we opted for the Chemex, and it was lacking the same intensity as the previous days, as the berry qualities have reverted back to being a fair bit more faint and presented in a slightly uneven bright sense, with a bit more of a graining quality this time around, as it wasn't particularly clean either. So I just didn't really like the experience either, and I said, I've heard that this coffee is better when you push it a little bit more, and given that we went lower on the extraction and it turned out a little worse, let's go ahead and flip the direction and go the entirely opposite way. And on day 29, we opted for the V60 with those higher extraction adjustments, and to my surprise, it was the best it had been to this point, and that goes to show that oftentimes you can get in your own way when you think you know a lot more about a coffee than you actually do, as common knowledge based off experiences with a lot of these coffees would say go the other direction, but I was completely wrong, as this was significantly better than those previous days, as so many of these strawberry aspects were presented in a much more intense sense. Tropical citrus, as well as the coffee, is continuing to offer a very unique presentation, especially for a Mejorado coffee, and I'll probably get into that a little bit more later. Day 32 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee is the best it had been to this point, with an even better defined strawberry attribute and tons of sweetness. The pineapple is presented in a slightly unripened sense, but even then it is pretty well defined and pronounced as well. So on day 35, we opted to go back through the Chemex one more time, and it was the same in regards to the strong berry attributes of this coffee, as it's very strawberry candy today with a strong honeysuckle-like feel. The entire experience is a little bit strange, as it feels like a very clean natural with a high intensity and a red berry focus, and that's a little bit what I'm hinting towards, given that it's rare I have wash processed coffees that have this strong of a red fruit component to them. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 2 level 5s, which oftentimes can come off very surprising for a wash processed non-geisha coffee, but here we are. Let's go through both of those, and we will start with the sweetness level 5. So this does have that mejorado-like sweetness, and it is presented almost uniquely and entirely in that red fruit sense, as they do have that strawberry jam note listed on here, and it's extremely apt given that it has a nice combination of just really red fruit forward components and really strong sugary sweetness to it. So for that reason, it is justified at that level 5 mark. So it's so interesting to me. This coffee is actually very, very interesting to me. And this is one of the main reasons I love reviewing Mejorado coffees, is because you don't necessarily know what you're going to get from them. And they do turn out to be a little bit different, but what seems to be consistent among them is that for the most part, they all seem to be just extremely sweet. And the sweetness can be presented in a number of different ways. And in this case, the sweetness was presented in a red fruit sense that just made it so unique in that regard. So yes, very sugary and sweet with what you'd expect for a Mejorado coffee, but the overall presentation of it skewed so heavily in that red fruit sense that the berry fruit scores there at that level 5 mark. And I'm just going to touch on this real quick. Cleanliness is at a level 4, and usually when I see those two things, sweetness and berry fruit at a level 5, it's a bad thing because it means that the coffee has become a little bit too heavy and overbearing. Usually this is associated with more heavier processed coffees, a lot of anaerobic coffees, but that certainly wasn't the case with this one, as it's clean enough to the point where you say it could act as a natural processed coffee given the overall intensity, but at the same time, it doesn't have any of the heavier, more fermenty qualities to it. It's presented in a cleaner sense. So that's just very interesting to me. And I really wanted to discuss that within this tasting wheel. Those three things go together, and it's very important to discuss those together. Finish level 4, and it does have a pretty prominent finish to it, and it does continue to skew in that red fruit sense. I think that's the other thing, since it didn't score a level 5 on that, that also keeps the overall, we'll say, overbearing aspect to it toned down. Florality, level 4. And there is plenty of the honeysuckle-like qualities to it. I will be completely honest, that and the citrus fruit, both there at the level 4, are definitely afterthoughts. They're there, they're present, you can feel them, they're pretty well defined, but given that this coffee is just so heavily skewed in that red fruit-like sense, those are things that I don't necessarily think about too much while I'm consuming this coffee. They're just kind of additional attributes that are presented within it. And then a final thing worth discussing, actually 2 more things worth discussing. Acidity level 3, not the brightest coffee out there, and I always say when it comes to Mejorado coffees, that and the other thing we're discussing, body at a level 3, you can never necessarily what to expect, because there isn't a lot of consistency within those 2 qualities. I feel like those can be manipulated based off of how a coffee roaster presents the coffee, so it can be maybe a little bit more bright than this one turned out to be, but I don't think that was necessarily the intent of this coffee, as it did feel a little bit more moderate at that level 3 mark. Same thing with the body, which did score level 3, just a little bit more texture to it in general, which isn't always the case for Mejorado coffees. Oftentimes they can also be there at the level 2. Brightness can be there at a level 4. It's a little bit of a crapshoot when it comes to these coffees to see what you might get from them. But outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I was very happy that I got an opportunity to review this one for all the reasons that I mentioned. It acts like a Mejorado in certain aspects, but at the same time, it goes to show that these Mejorados aren't one-dimensional and boring, because a lot of the times I come out with a lot of the same characteristics to it. Overly sweet, not necessarily the brightest, a lot of the brown candy aspects, a lot of the more floral, honey-like aspects to them. But having a coffee like this, which does have all of those things, they're all present, but skewed so heavily in one specific direction that has been unique to what I've experienced from these Mejorado coffees in this strawberry-like sense. I've had ones in the past that felt maybe a little bit more like a cherry soda, or maybe a little bit more like a floral aspect, like a red florality, or maybe a little bit more like a citric aspect, but they all seem to have this underlying super sweet theme to them and presented in a cleaner manner. So that's why this coffee was so interesting to me, and one that I very much enjoyed reviewing throughout the entirety. At the same time, I'm not the biggest fan of strawberry aspects within coffees, so I had mixed impressions of that, but at the end of the day, it just made for a very enjoyable review based off of how much I learned from this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you've always liked the more red fruit aspects of the natural processed coffees, but you've always wanted them to be a little bit cleaner, this one's actually a perfect fit for that, as not only does it offer that great intensity, that great sweetness, a lot of those red fruit qualities, but they're all presented in a prominent and cleaner sense to them as well. Couple that with the additional aspects, a lot of the citric qualities to it, a lot of those floral qualities to it, and you get a lot of great depth that is also presented within this coffee, making it just a little bit more unique, not just as far as Mejorado coffees go, but just wash processed coffees, especially Ecuadorian coffees in general. I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been your review of the Enrique Merino wash processed Ecuador from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.